I'm Wendy Chamberlain. I'm president of the Middle East Institute, and it's my very great pleasure to be able to co-host this event this afternoon with two organizations that the Middle East Institute works with very closely from time to time. With the Foundation for Middle East Peace, represented by President Lara Friedman, who's our moderator, and Mitvim, represented by Dahlia Schiendlin, who is our featured speaker today. And I can promise you you're in for a very interesting conversation. I've been enormously impressed in the number of panels and conferences and roundtables that I've shared with both of these extremely bright women. But Dahlia is one of the most vibrant and creative thinkers in Israel today. And she's been working for many years on a study that looks at non-recognized states with a particular focus on Cyprus, Kosovo, and Azerbaijan, Armenia, and how they relate to other issues. And I think we can't avoid the Palestinian question, which is something that Lara spends a good deal of her time working on. So it's a different kind of a discussion we're having today, and I welcome that. So we're very much looking forward to it. Lara is a former diplomat, American diplomat, who's now an authority on Israel and Palestine and the settlement situation and Jerusalem. She is our moderator and will lead the discussion. So I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
So it is my pleasure to welcome you here and thank MEI for partnering with the foundation in this event. And I want to give a shout out to Gabby Mitchell, who's over there, he just moved, from Mitvim, who is also co-sponsoring this event. So we have here Dahlia Schiendlin, who I think most of you probably know, so I'm going to do this very elliptically on her bio. And I will say that I've known Dahlia for years, and she is someone that I look to for creative thinking and insight. I think a lot of us, particularly those of us who've done this a long time, get into a groove, and having people who help us think outside that groove is important. We have robust discussions on this, which is always good. Dahlia is a well-known and highly respected public opinion expert and political strategist. Many of you may know her from her work on Israeli and international electoral campaigns over the past 20 years. She conducts research for a wide range of civil society organizations. Professionally, she wears many hats. That's how she earns her living. She is a fellow with Mitvim. Also, I should say, is a grantee of the foundation. We love them. She is a founder and writer for 972 magazine, also a grantee of the foundation. We love them. If you don't know them, you should check out their work, both organizations. And she co-hosts the English language podcast, the Tel Aviv Review. She has a PhD in political science from Tel Aviv University. She lectures at Tel Aviv University, I believe, right?
Not this year, but yeah.
And she is a regular commentator and writes for many, many outlets. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to hand it off to Dahlia to give a brief-ish synopsis of her work. I am going to listen closely because what is fun for me in this event is I don't know what this is. I'm going to learn from Dahlia with you, and then I'm going to ask a few questions to get the discussion going, and then we will hand it off to all of you to participate in that discussion. And I want to give a shout out to the very tall man who just walked in, Matthew Duss, former president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, who I succeeded in this role. So hello and thanks for coming. So Dahlia, why don't you start off, and then we'll start a discussion. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I'll start with a litany of thanks. Yeah, we're good? Feedback? Thank you to FMEP, first of all, for basically supporting my entire career with all these different organizations that you support, and for hosting this event. Thank you for Middle East Institute for jumping in at the last minute to help organize this and host me. And I will explain a little bit more about Mitvim, which is the organization that has sponsored this project. I'm talking today about a year's worth of research that I've been doing specifically to look at these comparative lessons that we can take from other conflicts. Mitvim is a small-ish, new-ish about 5-year-old foreign policy think tank in Israel. It's called, the formal name is Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. And they've sponsored me to do this project where I've just said, listen, there's lots we can learn from other conflicts. So there's a series of papers I've written. I'll be able to talk only briefly about each different conflict, but the project involved 5 different papers. 3 of them were case studies, so that if you don't think I'm going deep enough into any one conflict in this talk, feel free to read the entire paper on each one. And then we had some conferences around this and briefings and op-eds. Why did I decide to undertake this project? Let me try to briefly illustrate before I tell you why. We're going to talk today about a particular conflict in which one side has an ancient culture that has faced attempts at total extermination over the years by its enemies, and it's a historic trauma that shapes major aspects of this party's political outlook today in conflict, okay? But I'm not talking about Jews in the Holocaust, I'm talking about Armenians. And this history is a very influential factor in Armenian people's relationship both with Turkey and with Azerbaijan and the conflict we're going to be talking about today, which is Nagorno-Karabakh. I'll be addressing a conflict in which one party believes that its opponents are newcomers in their territory. They're not really native. They don't truly deserve national rights. But I'm not referring here to accusations of some Palestinians against Jews in Israel. I'm referring to a hardline, not everybody, but a hardline opinion of certain Greek Cypriots against Turkish Cypriots, who only came to Cyprus in the 16th century. So maybe Turkish Cypriots don't really have national rights. Okay, there's a lot of overlap in these narratives. In another conflict we hear, well, the other side, they're not really a people. They just invented their national identity to compete with our national identity, which is something that we very often hear. It's a potent argument heard by right-wing Israelis against Palestinians, but it's also what some Armenians say about Azerbaijan. They just developed their national identity in order to threaten us and our claims over Nagorno-Karabakh. Another conflict is one in which people say, one side says, this land is the cradle of our civilization. It is the holiest place we have. It is the only land that holds that level of holiness for us. And that gives a particular, holy force, religious force to the conflict. But I'm not talking about Jerusalem. It turns out there isn't only one Jerusalem. I'm talking about how Serbians relate to Kosovo. And then, of course, there's the meaning of violence. Is it terror or fighting for liberation? There's a conflict that saw 37,000 shootings and over 16,000 bombs and still managed to make peace, and that's Northern Ireland. In other words, when you look at these conflicts, you can't help but be struck, or I can't help but be struck, by uncanny similarities to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, either in narrative, history, memory, perceptions, but also current policies, what's happening in the conflicts, how they develop. And I think that you realize right away that they're not unique. They're not even unique in thinking they're unique, actually. But then the question is, why is that so important? Okay, why does it matter just to say, well, we're not unique? I think the reason is, and I was thinking about how to explain this today, it's easy to conflate uniqueness with intractability. I think when we say my conflict is really different, and that's why we can't resolve it, it becomes an excuse. You see, you hear this all the time. For people trying to resolve conflicts or work on this, oh, you have to understand why we're different from everybody else. It's sort of an excuse, and I don't want it to be an excuse. I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not so unique, and that makes it not so intractable, although things look very difficult right now. But of course, I'm doing this research to relate back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's the focus of the project. And of course, that's not to say that if we dispel the notion of uniqueness, the conflicts suddenly become more resolvable, that we suddenly realize we can resolve them. No, most of the conflicts we're looking at today have not been resolved. But if there are similarities, we can still draw on common experiences, policy ideas, look at the causes of escalation, and look at the circumstances where there have at least been breakthroughs towards resolving the conflict, if not outright peace agreements. So the not unique is one aspect of why I'm doing this. The other main reason, there are a few other main reasons before I jump into the cases. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is incredibly stuck right now. There is no peace process to speak of, but there is regular violence all the time, including an escalation at the Temple Mount a month ago, including a humanitarian disaster in Gaza right now. So there's no peace process, but the situation is urgent, I would even say desperate. but we haven't had a new idea with relation to either the process or what the process is aiming for, how we intend to solve the conflict or deal with the core issues in a long time. We desperately need new thinking. And so I've been able to look at other conflicts and I think sometimes get new ideas. And when you look at new ideas, looking at other regions can give you a somewhat more objective filter by which to assess what's going on. In other words, when you don't have quite as much a personal stake, when you're not as emotionally, personally involved in a conflict, and I think we all have to admit we have researcher bias, right? Even if we're all good, objective researchers and you've all come to this talk with a completely blank slate, I think it's worth realizing that when we are deeply engaged in a conflict, we always care on one side or the other. Looking at a conflict that is not directly within your area of experience, I think offers us a bit more objectivity within reason, of course. You become engaged in any conflict you study as well. Finally, the other main reason is that it's comparing conflicts and learning from one another is quite naturally a policy tool. So when I've spoken with diplomats for the sake of this project, I've spoken with negotiators, they all say, oh yeah, I took my experience from one place and brought it to the other, and they do it in practice, but they don't do systematic learning from it. So that's some of the background as to why I've done this project, and without further ado, I'll jump into some of the cases that we're talking about. As has been mentioned, I'm going to focus on Cyprus, on the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, which is over Nagorno-Karabakh, and on Kosovo and Serbia. Again, there are papers on these, so if you want more detail, I won't be able to get into too much history. I'm going to focus on what I think are the big takeaways for understanding things about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And those are all depressing and unresolved conflicts, so I will also touch briefly on those that have reached some sort of a peace agreement, which are Northern Ireland, Colombia, and South Africa, but only very briefly because they weren't the focus of my work. Let's start with Cyprus. Just like Israel and the Palestinians, we're looking at a conflict that is somewhere around 50 years old, depending on what your starting point is. People count the conflict as starting from either 1963 or 74. We're looking at two different people, language, culture, two different languages, cultures, religions. They can't agree on living separately or living together, how to share the land or provide equality for the different people. So there's basic similarities in the contours of the conflict. As people don't know, the island has been divided since 1974 when the Turkish army invaded following an attempted coup against the government. There was a big potential breakthrough in 2004. There was an agreement that was brokered by UN negotiators, and the UN has been deeply, deeply involved in sponsoring negotiations. If you read every, update, every sort of development in the negotiating process there, which started in 1968, you might really think it rivals the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for how much international effort has been invested in trying to advance that conflict. The leaders of both the Turkish and the Greek side did not agree with it, but it went to a referendum in 2004 with great expectations that just the fact that there was an agreement would somehow gather momentum. Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus, what some people call Greek Cyprus, was about to join the EU, and lots of people thought this referendum would pass. It failed on the Greek side. It passed on the Turkish side, but it needed both sides to have been ratified. And ever since 2004, negotiations have come and gone, including up until very recently, just early July, but they always fail. The current round that broke down in July culminated after about 2 years with two relatively pro-peace leaders, but they weren't able to get to a resolution. And I'll just bring this right away to the sort of Israeli-Palestinian perspective on it. Cyprus happens to be one of the conflicts among those I'm going to talk about that Israelis and Palestinians actually notice, probably because it's the proximity or something. And it's generally Israelis who notice it. And their big takeaway from comparing these conflicts is that Cyprus is sort of evidence that conflict management can work, that it's okay, things aren't so bad there. It's pretty peaceful, there's not too much violence, maybe we don't really need resolution. I would say a closer look, the analysis that comes out of the paper that I've written shows two problems with that. One illustrates that contrast can help just as much as comparison. It's not that Cyprus is peaceful because it hasn't been resolved. Quite the opposite. It's maybe just not as urgent because there's not, a terribly high level of violence. People aren't dying every day. And another major reason why it contrasts is that both people in Cyprus live essentially, de facto, if you go there and see, under civilian governments. And pretty much under their own governments, too. One is recognized, one is not. But nobody's living under a hostile military occupation. There's not as much desperation and suffering in daily life. So if you're going to compare outcomes and say, well, the outcome is that conflict management is okay, you need to also contrast the ingredients. And the other sort of, if you get a close-up look at the Cyprus conflict management concept, I think conflict management is deceptive. In Cyprus, and frankly, most conflicts that I work on, I don't think there's such a thing as a frozen conflict. There's no static status quo on the political level. In Cyprus, the longer there is no solution, the more Turkey, the country of Turkey, not Turkish Cyprus, the more Turkey is present in Cyprus. There's more cultural influence, economic control over northern Cyprus. The demographics of the island are changing because Turkish people come and move there. And this is essentially the Greek Cypriots' biggest fear, that Turkey will be more and more present on the island. It's not exactly something that Turkish Cypriots love either, to be honest. But the second reason why the status quo is deceptive is that political division of the island becomes deeper as the decades go by. It's been over 4 decades of a divided island. Anybody who's been to Turkish Cyprus knows that it looks and functions a lot like a separate state, which is exactly what the Republic of Cyprus, Greek Cyprus, does not want. And then there's the most extreme scenario, which is something that analysts talk about, and it's hard to imagine, but it's out there, and that's the idea of a creeping annexation or even a possible outright annexation move by Turkey, which is, of course, the nightmare of Cyprus. I don't think it's really going to happen, but now that the peace process seems truly dead, these things can't be completely ignored. One analyst recently told me after the last failure that we're like the frog sitting in the hot water, not noticing that it's boiling until it's boiled. So I'll stop there on Cyprus. The next conflict I'll talk about now is Kosovo and Serbia. Again, I feel badly skipping over all the history, but for the sake of getting to the bottom line, just a brief reminder, Kosovo also involves a disputed sovereignty claim, not entirely unlike Israel and the Palestinians. There's an entity that wants to be an independent state, wants to be sovereign, but Serbia claims that the territory is its sovereign territory, its cradle, the cradle of its civilization, or our Jerusalem, as I mentioned before. Kosovo wants sovereignty, but Serbia puts up signs around the north in Kosovo saying this is Serbia. So there's definitely a bit of a conflict of vision. But the conflict, again, is based on, it's an ethno-nationalist conflict with different people, different religions, language, culture, with all of the favorite stereotypes about one another that we know exactly from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Kosovo Albanians also lived under what was essentially about a 10-year military occupation, starting from 1989 when their autonomy was abrogated, and it was also a kind of segregation because they were kicked out of civil service and public sector. And that culminated, I'm sure I don't have to remind people here, that culminated in a massive war in 1999, a 78-day international intervention, NATO led by the US, and then a long political stalemate of almost totally intractable political dispute. But even Kosovo and Serbia, and I always say, if the Balkans are ahead of you on conflict resolution, you're really in trouble. But in 2013, there was a big breakthrough that had, anybody who follows this conflict very excited. And it was an interim agreement. It was a set of principles between Serbia and Kosovo, essentially led by 2 hardline nationalist leaders on both sides. One was the former head of the Kosovo Liberation, or a major player in the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was branded by Serbia as terrorists. One was formerly a minister in Milosevic's government, but they managed to come to the first actual diplomatic agreement, which was a set of principles again. And it wasn't a peace agreement, but it was a big breakthrough that people thought would lead to that, and it did involve some level of mutual compromise. Kosovo allowed the Serb minority living in the north to have their own kind of autonomous association. Serbia kind of de facto advanced a kind of recognition of Kosovo without ever saying anything like that, of course, but just doing, both sides agreeing not to block the other's path to the EU was sort of an implicit understanding that they both exist. But there was no treatment of final status issues. All the final status issues, what would be the nature of Kosovo's political status towards the end was not dealt with. But still, big breakthrough. The problem is that since then, the process has become essentially a mess. The 2 sides are deeply at odds over how to implement it. The Kosovars claim that Serbia is using a sort of ambiguity of the political status of the Serb minority in the north to actually deepen their control over the north, but also inherently undermine the sovereignty of Kosovo, and they don't believe that Serbia actually plans to get to the same endpoint that they plan to get to. So there's a lot of disagreement about what the actual agreement was intended to mean. And that causes constant struggles for power within this ambiguity that was created over territory, political gain. It's still a very unstable situation. It's not clear if that process is even going to be able to continue. And in this case, I would say that we have to keep in mind the idea that the process itself may end up killing the peace. It's just not clear right now. Kosovo is currently politically unstable, very unstable. They had elections. They haven't been able to form a government yet. This takes a toll. The question about the competence of the Kosovo government, well, their government would largely say, we're an unrecognized state. It's hard for us to have normal foreign and economic relations. We can't really develop to our fullest extent. Their people are starting to say, maybe that's an excuse. This conflict can't be the only thing that makes this government corrupt and incompetent. But the point is that an interim agreement on principles that's not actually dealing with final status and leaves a lot of what we used to call constructive ambiguity. Or let me rephrase that. What I used to call constructive ambiguity, and I now consider sometimes destructive ambiguity, specifically when it comes to elements of sovereignty and final status. So that's a warning lesson from the Kosovo peace process, Kosovo-Serbia. And the final case that I'll look at now is Nagorno-Karabakh. This is a case I'm assuming not too many people here know much about, but this is a piece of territory within Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, of course, emerged as an independent state during the years of the crumbling Soviet Empire into multi-ethnic and multinational. It was a multi-ethnic and multinational empire that broke down into republics that were more homogenous, but also not homogenous. So they had internal minorities, and Karabakh was one of those, mostly populated by majority of Armenians. The Armenians inside Karabakh, right, they were a majority in Karabakh, but a minority in Azerbaijan, had for most of the century wanted to unite with Armenia. I'll skip over all the escalation, but a very bloody war ensued in the early 1990s for about 3 years, resulting in the creation of something we're all familiar with from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's a refugee problem. 750,000, roughly, Azerbaijani refugees. Some of them are still not integrated to this day, internally displaced, a smaller number, but still a couple of 100,000 Armenian refugees. Again, the Armenians in Karabakh have, like many Armenians, the living memory of the trauma of the genocide in the early 20th century is very, very present in their political outlook, so that the violence, the mutual violence that happened during that war just revived all the sense of imminent existential threat and left it very explosive. It's completely unresolved. There's been no breakthrough. During the war, Armenians gained control of Karabakh and conquered an additional 7 territories around the original territory of Karabakh. So now even the international community considers those occupied territories. And the Armenians there are saying things like, well, actually they're ours. They've always been ours. Let's change the sign, names of streets and build roads, historicizing those territories to create facts on the ground. That sounds familiar too. The other thing is that this is a conflict that is also I would say by comparison to Cyprus and even Serbia and Kosovo, more violent. The violence has been sporadic, but ongoing throughout the last 20 years, including a very dangerous mini-war in April of 2016, not very long ago. It's a country that is, or it's a region that is very much influenced by regional dynamics and international actors. You can imagine it borders on Iran, Turkey, you've got Russia involved. Some people say Russia is selling arms to both sides, and the other great arms seller to the region is Israel. What emerged after diving deeply into understanding how this conflict is playing out and the lack of a genuine peace process is something that is going on inside both Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that's a rolling back or an erosion of democratic development. Okay, both of these countries emerged from the Soviet Union with great hopes of developing a democracy. Armenia was developing, I would say, more steadily along democratic lines, Azerbaijan less so. Both of them have seen a rollback. Azerbaijan to extreme levels, it's considered one of the most authoritarian societies today. But even Armenia is facing a lot of internal strife and deep sense of corruption and stagnation. And it's hard to separate this entirely from the conflict. I don't think it can be. And the reason is because the conflict plays such a prominent role in both societies' lives, from the hardline narratives of one another that justify a militant approach, which justifies militarization of both societies, the financial ramifications of that for the budget and the economy, and that the conflict, of course, and security around the conflict on both sides tends to be prioritized over democratic norms. Now, it might seem far-fetched to compare that to Israel and the Palestinians. Certainly on the Israeli side, very strong and stable democracy since its founding. But I would argue, and if you read my paper, you'll see why, that there are reasons to be nervous about the state of Israel's democracy, and the Palestinian democracy, we should all admit that there are reasons to be worried right now. So, I'd have to get into a longer explanation. Maybe we can get into it in the questions. But I would say that we need to take away from the Caucasus region how protracted, unresolved conflict influences the domestic situation of the two societies and probably isn't helpful to their democracies. Now, briefly, I promised a little bit of discussion of more successful conflicts. Let's start with Colombia very briefly, which it's on my radar because they reached an agreement in 2016. And I think the interesting thing to look at with Colombia is the referendum process. Okay, they held a referendum over an agreement between the government and the FARC. The public rejected the agreement. Why is this important for Israel-Palestine? Well, we have a referendum law in Israel. If there's a two-state agreement at any time where Israel gives up on territory that it controls or considers to be sovereign, we will have to have a referendum. And we can learn things from the failure of both the Colombia and the Cyprus referendum on the side of Republic of Cyprus, mostly that you can't bank on good feeling for the public to pass a referendum involving painful concessions. But this has to do with the process of how peace processes get passed. From Northern Ireland, I will look at that, juxtapose that with Bosnia briefly. Why would I look at those two together? Well, both of them reached an agreement somewhere around 20 years ago or a little bit more. Both of those agreements involve complicated structures of power sharing in one state frameworks. Okay, we're not looking at two separate states, although Bosnia is closer maybe to a confederation than a federation, but that's a different discussion. But they involve complicated power sharing. It's been over 20 years, and there's lots of criticism of these agreements. Every time you read about them today, from inside those regions, somebody is bound to say we need to reopen the Dayton agreements, we need to reopen the Good Friday agreements, it's not working anymore, crisis. From Israel-Palestine, I look at their crises and I say, I'd take it, because they haven't been killing each other for about 20 years. And that is a bigger zoom-out lesson that sometimes we have to change the bar of success. In Israel-Palestine, we desperately need an end to the violence, or at least less violence. And as a brief sort of way to end this part of the talk, I'll just mention that I got back from South Africa recently, first time I've ever visited there, which of course looms large in the mind of anybody my age. And among the many comparative insights, I think the biggest thing I noticed is that if you landed in South Africa the way I did, never having been there before, and you didn't know apartheid was over, you may not be sure it was over. There's a lot that still recalls the deep structural segregation, and it's not even in the books anymore. And my conclusion there is that it takes a long time to exercise the de facto structures of conflict, inequality, and injustice, and the sooner we start, the better. I'll stop here, even though I have lots more to say, but I hope that they will come out in the questions and answers. Thank you again for your attention.
We're going to have a little discussion up here, and then we'll open it up to you, so I get to have the power of the chair to ask you what I want. I want to start off where you left off. And you talked about ending conflict in terms of ending violence primarily. You didn't use the word justice or injustice until the very last sentence. And I think for those of us who work on Israel-Palestine and looking at the lessons to be learned from your study, and I haven't read the whole paper, I read the brief version that you sent me, I am interested in terms of looking at the conflict resolution lessons here. I worry that one of the lessons people derive listening to you is that really there are conflict management options, and we should be looking for things less than resolving. And not because that's optimal, but because, as Dan Shapiro said in his piece in Tablet the other day, 2 days ago, suboptimal may be the best we can do. I'm not challenging, I want to ask you about that, because for those of us who work in conflict resolution, it isn't merely a question of, well, is it a tolerable level of violence? Are we resolving or bringing down violence? But are we actually resolving the conflict? Is Israel-Palestine considered stable if the level of violence is brought down, but we haven't actually ended the occupation and all the injustices that go with that? So can you relate that to some of these other conflicts?
Yeah. Let me be very clear. If there was any misunderstanding, I do not advocate conflict management. I think that the cases where there has been no agreement are in a far worse position by any measure, violence or nonviolence. I mean, even Cyprus, which is relatively nonviolent, I think, my only bias here in this entire research project, I'd like to think, of course we all have our unconscious bias, but my main bias is that I've been looking ultimately at all this analysis for ways of advancing diplomatic resolution to conflict. And Cyprus is the only case I think that is any way possibly an argument for it, and I've tried to erode that argument by explaining why I think it's deceptive. Although it's true that people are not living so badly there, and I have to admit that day-to-day reality counts for something when the situation in Israel-Palestine is so severe that it does seem that, if you're thinking triage, the first thing to do would be provide relief to people who are living under direct military occupation, have astronomical levels of, unemployment, and never mind, electricity 2 hours a day. That demands immediate relief, and it demands a sustainable peace agreement. So I think that my final point also was that even though I address those more resolved conflicts very briefly, they're not really resolved. In other words, we need to lower the bar of what resolution means. It does not mean giving up. When I say that, I don't mean giving up on a peace accord, or whatever you want to call it. We don't like the word peace anymore these days in the Middle East. A final status accord. I don't think we should give up on them because those societies are proof. Those societies, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, South Africa, they're proof that when you have a political resolution to the conflict, you're able to put the processes in place that will one day make things better, and generally the level of violence has also lowered afterwards. And of the 3 cases that I looked at that were unresolved, only one has that lower level of violence. So no, I absolutely think we need diplomatic resolution. But I think my point about that is that we don't have to, we shouldn't use the excuse that it won't solve all the problems as a reason not to do them. And that's what we see increasingly on the Israeli-Palestinian debate. Well, we can't resolve this issue. It won't resolve that issue. Okay, no agreement will resolve every issue. But then again, conflicts don't really end. They take generations to, and human conflict never ends anyway. But we can do better.
Right.
If we have, and again, I'm a big advocate of a diplomatic resolution.
Right. No, I appreciate that. You and I talked briefly before we sat down. I want to press you on the issue of violence and nonviolence, and I think I'm certainly a longtime advocate of only nonviolent methods. I think that is sort of, at this point, the sine qua non of the entire, of all these conflicts, people who are working for solutions. When I look at the conflicts that you discuss and the role of violence in the period before there's a resolution, or some of the conflicts you don't discuss, when we're talking about Kurds or Basque or in Catalonia, for those of us who work on Israel-Palestine, we have witnessed, and we're witnessing today, the ongoing delegitimization of nonviolent means of protesting the status quo, including our efforts here in the States. It is argued by some that if you deprive people of the legitimacy of nonviolent means, you push them towards violence, and that violence, in some cases, is seen to work, which puts all of us in a very awkward position arguing, no, you absolutely can't, and it will never work. Can you just touch on that however you wish?
I mean, there are so many ways of thinking about that. I think the fundamental problem is that there's a deep hypocrisy in how the international community responds to violence. The rhetoric is about nonviolence, play by the rules, be nice, and you'll get your diplomatic rewards, but that tends not to happen. I mean, look at, again, Northern Cyprus Cyprus in general, very nonviolent, and neither a peace accord nor, any sort of advances for the two sides that don't use violence. Kosovo is a great example of the hypocrisy. Essentially, Kosovo was completely forgotten in the Dayton Accords, which is one of the reasons why it became violent, because they had a big and entrenched and very elaborate and rather all-encompassing civic strategy of nonviolent opposition to the Serbian regime. which they implemented in very elaborate ways, including elections and parallel health and education system, an underground education system. I mean, they had practically a state within a state, all as a form of nonviolent nation building in a way. And Dayton happened, and they were nowhere. And that's when you saw people leaving that civic struggle and saying, forget about it. Ibrahim Rugova, who was the leader and the symbol of that, his way is not working. We need to form what was at the time a shadowy, sort of unknown organization called the Kosovo Liberation Army, which, arguably, if you read my friend Stacey Sullivan's wonderful book, arguably helped, by the time they got more and more violent, help pull in the great powers and help pull in America because the violence was ratcheted up. In other words, the Kosovars provoked Serbia. Serbia responded with disproportionate force. The international community said, oh my God, it's going to be another Bosnia. We better get involved. That's a reward for violence if I ever saw it. Then there's a different kind of reward for violence, which is not so much a reward as it is supporting the infrastructure by international or other countries selling arms or providing aid to buy arms. And the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict is a strong example of this. I think without Russian arms sales, both during the 1991-93 war, 1991-94, and now, the conflict is heavily, heavily militarized, largely because of Russia's arms sales and increasingly also because of Israeli arms sales.
Yeah.
When you have, when you hang a gun on the wall in the first act, it's going to go off.
Yes. So I want to ask you something that may be a little bit outside of your area today, but we're sitting here in Washington, so maybe you can speculate on this, or maybe you covered it. I am old enough to remember an era as someone who worked watching Capitol Hill where I had to line up in person to go to important hearings on the Hill. And the most important hearing, if you cover foreign affairs, is the Foreign Ops bill for the Appropriations Committee. And we would line up hours in advance to get into the room so you'd know what was going on, what was being said. This is before everything was televised. And it's interesting when you go over your conflicts, because I observed for years that those of us who got there first, to get the first seats and first to stand in line to make sure we got in, it was these people who lobby on right, left, center on Israel. It was the Turks. It was their Armenians and the Azerbaijans. This is how I learned about Nagorno-Karabakh. They were there every time. This is this little club of conflict watchers. And what was
They're
interesting...
They're not just watchers, they are participants.
Well, it
They're
was.
activists.
But what was interesting, and this is my question for you, whether or not you can talk about this, it wasn't just that you had the embassies there. You had me at the time representing Americans for Peace Now. You had AIPAC. You had the Armenian National Assembly, whatever. All of these groups had domestic constituencies that were strongly engaged in advocating for various policies on Capitol Hill. You use Armenians for an example. I mean, they are very strong in certain districts. Yes. And that always seemed to me to have the fact that that was the group that was impacting policy in this very direct way. What role that plays, either as helping push for resolution or enabling continuation of conflict. Did you look at that at all as the diaspora element and how that engages foreign powers to act?
It's a very interesting question. It wasn't a specific focus of my research, but there's no question that the most comparable cases are the Jewish diaspora and the Armenian diaspora. Not in large part, actually, because the Armenian diaspora consciously models itself after some of the tactics and techniques of the Jewish diaspora. I think the Armenians that I've spoken to a lot of times say we feel close to the Jews because we also went through a genocide and we're so impressed with how you've revived your thousands-of-year-old nation. They have Armenian birthright, So I think it's absolutely the case that they can be compared. And I think the thing that and not only them, I mean, there's another interesting role of the Albanian diaspora because many of them were coming over from the Balkans already in the 1980s. And again, I can only praise Stacey Sullivan's book on this because it's a very, good rendition of how how people living in the diaspora feel all of a sudden, so when their homeland is under, threat. You had like teenagers who grew up here just get up and leave and go join the Kosovo Liberation Army. So that's one direct form of but I think that the organized diaspora as a political force is really the Jewish-Armenian case. And what I have found when I've looked at this, again, not systematically in my papers, but still it jumps out. The diasporas often tend to be more hardline in some ways than the people living inside the conflict. And I would venture even a little further to say that among the Armenian diaspora people that I've met, there are more monolithic views, a sort of across the board, we defend the Armenian position, very, much less of the, raucous disagreements that we have in the Jewish community. I don't know if that's, why exactly, but in general, I would say the American Jewish community has kept the narrative, certainly over the last few decades, much more hardline than the rather more diverse, and critical attitudes in the Israeli community, which is similar among the Armenian diaspora. There's probably other conflicts that I can think of that have that. And I think that it's natural because people who feel close to a society but they're not living there, but they feel part of it, they don't know all the nuances, and they may also not feel as free to criticize when they're not actually there. So it makes sense. And when you see something from outside, of course, you don't see all the resolution. And the first thing you want to do is just defend the country you feel close to.
So I'm going to do a follow-up question, then I'm going to turn to all of you. So get ready with your questions. I will be calling on you. I expect a question that begins with a like what, where, when, who, how. And if you don't ask a question, I will interrupt you. I'm known for that. So I'm going to do a quick follow-up. So on that last point, because I want to push you on this, because this is something that interests me, is the question of whether or not this diaspora role it changes it. So for instance, I grew up in an era, I remember as a kid in Tucson, Arizona, there was a place that I used to shop on 4th Avenue where there were Irish Americans and there was an IRA flag. And I remember my mother trying to explain to me about the IRA, and at that point a terrorist organization, but there was a flag and everybody knew he was collecting money and sending it. And you have actual outside forces as a diaspora, and as a diaspora that has political weight in a country that has political weight. The role that plays in changing the possibilities for reaching an agreement.
Yeah.
I mean, I have heard, there's a famous quote from Hanan Ashrawi during the early peace process, when he said to the Americans, "You are an obstacle to peace," because allegedly you had negotiators at the table, the Americans taking harder line positions than the Israelis.
Right. You just reminded me of a recent conversation I had with a Turkish Cypriot colleague, and he said, "You know what I can't stand? When I go to England and those Turkish Cypriots living in England say, 'Why do you say Nicosia? You should say Lefkosha,' right, of course, Lefkosha, why don't you say Lefkosha?" And he says, and I tell them, "You jerks, I'm speaking English." But the point is, it's, the symbolism of calling it Lefkosha is like, much more for the people living in England. He says, they don't know what they're talking about, they're not living here. So yeah, this situation is, I think it's probably across the board. I think it can change policy when the diaspora has a seat at the table, when the diaspora has reached a level of influence on policymakers that constrains people who are directly involved in negotiations. I mean, this is a whole other area that I love to talk about, which is the relationship between leaders who are negotiating with the other side in a conflict and their people. It's, what the sociologist Robert Putnam called the two-level game. You have to listen to your people and negotiate with the other side. That can be true of negotiators as well. So an American president negotiating with Israel and the Palestinians is also going to be listening to political constraints at home. And that's certainly going to affect policy if, it's a situation where that diaspora has really taken political activism to that level.
All right. I'm going to open it up. I'm going to start actually with Ned, and then I'll go around. So much keeping on the time. We said this is going to go till 4. I'm going to keep it going till 4:15. If people need to leave earlier, they can, and we can continue the discussion informally after that. So, go.
Dahlia,
Hi.
Hi. Thanks so much. I feel like the way that you're framing this, it allows us to kind of keep it real, meaning stop talking about the requirements of a final lasting settlement that is elusive in all these situations, and look at what's actually happening on the ground. How can it be a better situation that might in the long term lead that way? I wanted to ask about a couple of issues on that note. One is the contributions of civil society and funding for civil society. I'm doing some comparative work looking at Northern Ireland, where that was peace building and civil society was very heavily funded, and Israel-Palestine, where it's very lightly funded. And so contributions where the political process may not be working well, in Northern Ireland it's not working very well, but they don't go back to violence. And I think perhaps there's a contribution of all that civil society work on the ground there. The second question is a harder one about the track 1 peace process. Mm-hmm. Should we abandon the idea that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed?
Mm-hmm. Should we take a few or just do one-on-one? You have two, so maybe I'll start with.
Let's take a couple. Let's do one more.
Oh, a couple more, okay.
Sorry, okay, let's do a follow-up right here.
I'm Tom Getman. Thank you for this evocative flight of the situations. I worked in South Africa, the Middle East, and Cyprus for 40 years.
Oh.
I also want to
getting
ask
to talk.
want to ask about civil society, because it was the Endgame group with the Stellenbosch professors in South Africa, was the two mayors in Cyprus that hooked up the
Yes.
sewage and electrical system. There are people in Israel and Palestine that are transcending all of the roadblocks and barriers and walls. And I want to know about that too, because I think that's a major thing that we all can be encouraging in our visits.
Yeah, two good questions on civil society, okay.
Why don't you start with that?
Okay. Yeah, civil society, I'm a fan, of course. I think it's an important part for a number of reasons. A, because it helps, especially when there's times when the political process isn't moving ahead. I'm not going to get all lovey-dovey about this. I don't think civil society can really flip the situation. I have not seen that happen. But I do think civil society can retain the infrastructure, the networks of people who want to be engaged on the peacemaking level until the moment is ready for them to be there. You know, maybe sometimes they can help nurture leaders who eventually go into politics too. But I mean, it's not like I've really seen civil society activity directly making the change. But I think that there's always an interplay between the track one and, well, between the political leadership and civil society and the public. You can also add the media in there too, but I think that media just brings them together. And they feed off one another. So when the leaders don't feel any pressure coming from their societies, they're not likely to do anything. This is what we have in Israel right now. They're not interested. The public's not driving it forward. And there's such a feedback loop with the politicians that civil society isn't able to really change that. But the fact that it's there means that all the people who do care about advancing the political process have somewhere to go and something they can do, and they get to know each other. And we're not so, I say we because I'm a proud member, we're not so alone. The isolation that people feel when they want to take a stance towards a pro-peace stance can be terrifying and sometimes physically isolating. So that's one thing. I think maybe even the biggest thing in a way. Of course, when there's a process in motion, I think in 2004 in Cyprus, there was a lot of activism of civil society in the north that I think very much empowered the leaders, but also the voters. The Turkish North passed that referendum by 2/3. And I think that's largely because they were out there getting, NGOs and labor unions and students to demonstrate, and that made a big difference. Civil society can also go the other way. There are organizations in civil society that have the opposite effect. Religious organizations, sports teams tend to be more nationalist and hardline in most conflicts. So it also, it's a question of what counts as civil society, and I would say if I look at all the conflicts together that I can think of, we should look at civil society very inclusively, as the broadest possible definition. I mean, in the Israeli-Palestinian front, it was a group of academics who helped advance the Oslo peace process when it was still very secret. So we should include, academics, NGOs, labor unions, student groups, religious organizations, because religious organizations, of course, again, are often more hardline in ethno-nationalist conflicts. But if you can co-opt members of the religious institutions, that's a very powerful force. I've sort of pointed that out in the different papers, but it hasn't been a specific focus, but I think it's an important one. Also because civil society is part of democracy. And I think that I am concluding, I didn't go into the project with this particular aspect in mind, but democracy, I think, becomes key to conflict resolution. If you don't care about your democracy, it's perfectly fine to continue a conflict. If you place democratic principles as a top priority, they will lead you eventually to wanting to end the conflict. And the more civil society there is, the more you strengthen and nurture democratic culture. Okay. That's what I would say about civil society. In terms of interim agreements, I'm calling it interim agreements, but you're saying this concept that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, I'm a little bit torn. On the one hand, I believe in small progress where possible because it makes people feel like there's hope and momentum. And we know that in my day job, I'm also a public opinion researcher, and we know that the lack of belief that a process exists or can work in Israel and Palestine right now is driving down support, even for the two-state solution. Just the fact that it seems so remote and nobody believes the process can actually work. So if you have an interim step, some sort of breakthrough, even if it's a small thing, even this little water agreement that was, signed a few weeks ago with the help of the American government, that can go a long way towards changing the general mood and building trust and helping to get momentum and goodwill going. Having said that, I, through this process, especially on the Kosovo case, have become very skeptical of both long-term interim processes with no definitive end, and the ambiguity of final status, and the ambiguity even in the moment, for example, of sovereignty, of who really controls, in this case, the north of Kosovo, north of Mitrovica, where you have a Serb minority. It's leading to enormous problems that are reopening the whole question of where the end game is going. And if I look back again at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I have long thought, actually, since I wrote an article at the 20-year anniversary of Oslo, that part of the reason Oslo did not work was because it was two-phased. It took too long to do the different phases, and in that time, settlements grew and occupation deepened. And that sparked all the kinds of cycles of violence and frustration that we know. So I'm of two minds on this. I don't have one answer, but I think, put it this way, I do think that interim or individual progress and advances have their place in the right conditions. But if you're looking at agreements, anything more comprehensive, I would prefer clarity of final status, and certainly clarity on sovereignty and less constructive ambiguity, which I now doubt is really constructive.
I will say for me, after years of doing this issue, the term constructive ambiguity I consider to be one of the most poisonous terms that occurs.
She agrees with me. What more could I ask for? This is not always the case, by the way.
No, absolutely. But we have good discussions. All right, so more questions. I'm going to go here and then here.
Thank you very much. Do you believe that all peace agreements have to be in writing, that they have to be written peace agreements instead of, let's say, de facto peace agreements? So, for example, on the island of Cyprus, right? The way that it is now, I would submit it's easier to cross the border there between the two Cypruses than, let's say, to go from here to Canada or from here to Mexico, right? They have their separate governments, they have their separate languages, they have their separate et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To me, that might be a de facto peace agreement. And would that be something that, do you need a written peace agreement?
And then over here in the center.
I usually talk about de facto states, not de facto peace agreements, but okay.
There. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Saeed Arakat. I'm a Palestinian journalist. You mentioned that all ideas have been exhausted to resolve. All ideas have been exhausted, and there is a need for new ideas. What should the Palestinians be doing to end the occupation, end the conflict? Especially when you have the conflict so lopsidedly, in favor of one party to this conflict. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I could, on that question, the disparity of power, I think, is an important point that I'm sure you talk about in your paper. If you can touch on that, sort of full-blown occupation versus, quasi-occupation. I mean, there's different status of peoples that are seeking independence or liberation or whatever it is. So, yeah, just to follow up on that.
Yeah, very good questions. So on the idea of a de facto peace agreement, I mean, this goes back to my overall analysis of Cyprus. You're calling it a de facto agreement, I'm calling it conflict management. We're talking about essentially the same thing. If you look at it, it looks like things are okay in Cyprus. Again, my basic analysis was that that's deceptive because the reality on the ground is changing. And it's changing in ways that Greek Cypriots certainly don't like, right? More control of Turkey, greater division of the island, even threatening, this extreme scenario of a Turkish move for annexation, which again, I admit is probably far-fetched. The Turkish Cypriot side is not so happy with the developments either. In other words, the increasing Turkish control over their economy and culture and even population is not something that they're particularly happy about. And then there's the situation of the Turkish Cypriots. How long can they actually live as an unrecognized entity, recognized only by Turkey and only able to function through Turkey? I mean, it's been livable. It's certainly more livable than living under a hostile military occupation. But it's not a formula for long-term development. And ultimately, I think that they're seeing depopulation. A lot of people who are Turkish Cypriots, not just people who come from the mainland, leave, feel they don't have prospects, and it is a tough comparison because, again, by contrast to the very violent, very active conflicts, it does look nice, but I would say it's deceptive politically for the reasons that I mentioned. In terms of, this touches on the question of equality. There's no question that the severe inequality in a conflict makes it very difficult to have successful negotiations. And when I was thinking, I thought somebody was going to ask me a hardball question, which is the question that I've been asking myself: why are some of these conflicts more violent than others? I think that is, the thing that keeps me awake at night. Why is it that Cyprus is not very violent, and in Israel-Palestine people are getting killed, every day? Why does that happen? I don't have a good answer, but I do think it has something to do with the levels of equality. On Cyprus, again, not to romanticize Cyprus, but I've spent a lot of time there. I've probably spent more time there than the other conflicts myself. There's a lot more stability of daily life. People are living okay. The Republic of Cyprus has all the problems of every country in the Eurozone, and they had their financial implosion a couple of years ago and a big financial crisis. But the North, you don't even have abject poverty, let alone crime. People living just, fine. And I think that situation, on some level, is detrimental because it doesn't seem like it's quite as urgent, right? You can legitimately ask the question, maybe it's okay. But I think that, notwithstanding the very recent failure of negotiations, this is the sad thing. I mean, I think it's sad. But this two-year negotiation process that just failed, with two pro-peace leaders, right? People who was arguing civil society, right? Both leaders who actually seem to advocate peace couldn't make it. Why couldn't they do it? Well, it's hard to say. But I think that they still had better chances than any of the other cases I talked about, because neither side is coming at this really from a deep sense of the huge current living injustice being done to me. And that is poisonous to a peace process, absolutely. In terms of what the Palestinians can do, listen, if I had the magic bullet, I would give it to you right now. I don't. But I will say that, on a historic level, one of the tragic things I think about the Palestinians, going back to your question on violence, is that if violence, for better or for worse, put Kosovo on the map, and violence for better or for worse, was what tore apart Nagorno-Karabakh from Azerbaijan and gave the Armenians control there. Violence has not helped the Palestinian cause. Nonviolence has not helped the Palestinian cause. The political elite diplomatic process has not helped the Palestinian cause, and frankly, nothing has helped the Palestinian cause. This is a strange sort of anomaly in history, although, in fairness, there has been progress, right? Palestine, by contrast to the other cases I mentioned of sort of unrecognized states, has more diplomatic recognitions than any of them. It has declared independence now, I think, 3 times. And so it has some infrastructure of recognition of statehood more than the others, which is progress compared to the 1960s, when most of the Western world, wasn't sure there was a Palestine, But I think that for the sake of the Palestinian people living in the region, and I'm leaving out the diaspora right now because it is such a different case, and even the refugees I have to leave out because they will have to be resolved as part of a negotiated agreement. But for the immediate situation of Palestinians on the ground, I would say, probably the main thing is to do whatever can be done to strengthen democratic institutions. Right now, I think the thing that is a cancer on Palestinian society is government corruption. I say this, of course, all in the shadow of the occupation. I don't really believe that you can develop in any way fully as a state with the level of control that Israel has over the Palestinians, which is, the army is the ultimate sovereign over all things. So there can be no illusions about that. It's never going to be, Palestinians are never going to have even the opportunities for democratic development that the other unrecognized cases I talked about have had. But they can still, and I bring this back to, for example, Kosovo, with all the frustrations of government, of the people against their government, and the sense that they're corrupt and exploitative and getting all this international money and wasting it. There's similarities there. The people of Kosovo are starting to say, can you really blame all of this on the fact that we're not a UN member? Can't we do better? And I think that there's some relevance to that in Palestine too. Even under the constraints, there is, frankly, in my mind, no excuse for how the Palestinian Authority is treating people in the West Bank, and no excuse for punishing 1.8 million people in Gaza by cutting off their electricity. Just as there is no excuse for a 50-year ongoing military occupation.
All right, we have time for another round if we have questions. There, and then here.
Stephen Stern. Lara brought up justice, and then the previous discussion had to do with asymmetries and imbalances of power and the starkness of military occupation. Are there lessons from some of the other conflicts about the outside involvement of other nations, of advocates from those nations in terms of either addressing or deepening these imbalances in either negotiating or civil society processes that you can call on that might help? And you look at peace building in terms of Israel-Palestine, or building Palestine nonviolent agency and strength, Palestinian nonviolent agency and strength. Are there lessons from the other conflicts?
I'm not sure if I totally understand the question. Are you saying, are there lessons for how other specific countries have contributed to the imbalance or possibly helped to balance inequalities?
Essentially. I mean, are there things that you're seeing that are moving in terms of the relationships from outside to these conflicts that can either help or exacerbate?
Yeah. Let me start with that one, because I think that's a little bit complicated.
Okay.
I think that there are situations where simply recognizing one side of the conflict helps to equalize, right? In a situation where, you know, your very existence isn't being seen, like, you know, take the Kosovo situation. They weren't part of Dayton. They felt like they were completely lost, you know, left out and unrecognized. When America got involved, okay, it got involved, you know, with NATO behind it and a lot of military force, but I think the idea that people knew who they were was a big part of it. I think that's also been the case to some extent in the Karabakh conflict, you know, having the international mediators. They're mediators. It's not a negotiation process. Sort of recognizing all, you know, the different sides to some extent, although, no, actually I was going to use it as an example of the opposite. The fact that Karabakh Armenians are not formally represented at the mediation process has been part of what's kept up, you know, something like an imbalance. That's been, you know, difficult. Certainly, I think the deep, deep sense of American involvement being very weighted in favor of Israel has been detrimental to the Palestinian side. We know from every survey that a large majority of Palestinians and Israelis think that America is completely weighted to Israel's side of the map. So there's no question on either side that that's not helping to, you know, balance things out. And then, of course, you have to think about international involvement in other ways. It's not just about peacemaking. Again, it's arms sales. It's international proxy politics, right? I mean, Karabakh is a great example of proxy politics. The Balkans, too, especially the Western Balkans now after the election of Trump, you know, there's a serious concern about whether this is going to become another field for, you know, the Russia-West conflict. Or are we entering a neo-Cold War environment? I mean, proxy politics is just as much a part of that. It doesn't necessarily change the balance of equality, but it certainly influences the potential for peace. And yeah, because usually proxy politics means somebody's playing on one side of the conflict or the other.
All right, so, yes.
Thank you. Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. First of all, I was at the UN on July 7th when the state of Palestine did their first vote on the treaty on the prohibition of the use of nuclear weapons. So that was a historic moment that few people heard about. And so my question is, you're talking about like conflict management and conflict resolution. And there's another level, which is conflict transformation, where you sort of create a new reality. So just one example is Johan Galtung had this idea of a 6-state solution based on the, you know, instead of just the bilateral. But also there are processes, like say the Truth and Reconciliation process had some flaws and pushed too much of forgiveness. By background, I'm a psychologist. I used to be a therapist, so I kind of think of this as like political therapy. And you mentioned academics, but also say social scientists or people that really deeply analyze conflict and trauma and healing and humiliation and envy and all those forces. And then there's also vested interests which drive the conflict, rather than sort of superficial approaches. So I don't see how we can really solve a conflict if all those dimensions aren't being addressed.
Should I jump into
So
that?
we've got one more from Matt. We'll give Matt the last question. Do you want to go now, or do you
we
want
have
to
one
wait?
more person.
Oh, sorry. Okay, Matt's getting the last question. So yes.
Thank you. You mentioned Cyprus.
Better be a good
especially
one.
Northern Cyprus. From the Northern Cyprus Embassy. In Northern Cyprus, yes, there is no poverty. Crime level is very low. Democratic institutions are in place. But still, life is not so fine for the Turkish Cypriots because they cannot fly directly. They cannot play soccer even with mainland Turkish teams. So, I mean, if the Greek Cypriots are so much worried about their Turkish Cypriot compatriots, why are they dragging their feet on the negotiation table and not accepting the political equality of the Turkish Cypriots?
Okay, and now we're giving it to Matt for the last question.
Thanks. I'm wondering if the work, if you looked at the role of great power patrons in these specific examples, obviously with Israel, with the United States, Serbia, with Russia, or if there are other examples outside the set that you looked at, and like the role, helpful, unhelpful, in any of these, attempts at resolution.
Yeah. Okay, but those three will wind it up.
Okay, very interesting questions.
And you can say anything else you want now. Also, any questions that
I'm not
weren't
sure if
asked
you want
that
to
you
open
wish
that
were
door.
asked, cover anything you want.
Okay, on the emotions of conflict, I completely agree. I mean, actually, that had a lot to do with my initial academic research. My doctoral research on nation and state building and these unrecognized conflicts had a lot to do with what is the process of building a nation. It's a lot about emotions, right? It's a lot about the symbols of the political symbols that make us feel connected to a nation. So, in terms of what drives ethno-nationalist conflicts, emotions are a huge part of it, and what will help change conflicts also has to be on the emotional level as well. I think that the thing about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or transitional justice is maybe part of this too. I've done some work on transitional justice, and the more I work on transitional justice, the more I come to think I don't see how it can really transform things until the conflict is formally over, because the conflict isn't really over, but at least the structures are in the process of being broken down. Now, in a situation of ongoing conflict, whatever form it takes, you have fresh trauma every day. And all of the kinds of emotions that lead to a conflict cycle are just being perpetuated all the time, and they're usually being interpreted in light of a mythical historic trauma. It's not only the Armenians, right, who have the mythic historic trauma of the genocide. Most nations have a founding trauma. And the longer the conflict goes on, every little thing is interpreted in light of that. I mean, in Israel, we have a situation where a 13-year-old girl can wave a scissors and people see it as the next Holocaust. I'm not, disparaging those emotions. Those are very real, but they're also not very healthy. And so I think that, those incidents will always happen, but when there is a framework for how it's going to be resolved, and, you take away many of the kinds of events and incidents that perpetuate them, then you can start a very long-term process of that kind of transformation you're talking about. It's great to try to start it before, if possible. It's just, I have not really seen how that has the transformative role that it needs to have in order to reach, a formal end to the conflict. But I think that ignore emotions at your peril. Everybody should understand different categories and kinds and categories of emotions, both in terms of the lead up and the background and history of conflict, to the perpetuation of conflict, to the eventual resolution of conflict. Why did the Republic of Cyprus drag its feet? Well, I mean, I don't want this to turn into, haggling over who was to blame. There's a lot of it. But I can tell you that from the Greek Cypriot side, from the Republic of Cyprus side, I think one of the biggest sticking points was the insistence on the continued presence of Turkish troops on the island. Now, this does tie into Matt's question about patron states, because Turkey is, such an overwhelming player in the region that many people have thought, I don't totally agree, but I partially agree, because you can't not. One person, I don't remember who it was, said to me one time, there will be an agreement in Cyprus when Turkey wants there to be. I mean, that is part of the reality going on there, and there was one of the reasons why 2004 was an opportunity, because Turkey had reasons to want an agreement then and support it, and now Turkey's in a very different position. Still, it's hard to assess exactly what Turkey's role was, but there was this insistence on some continued presence. Now, the big argument is, why does it matter? The number they were talking about was something like 650 troops. So why should the Republic of Cyprus really be so nervous? Well, I think that also ties back into the first question, because the Republic of Cyprus is remembering that in 1974, the Turkish army just invaded the island twice, and took over a third of the island and divided it for 40 years, and that's never going to go away. And so, the symbolism of these things makes a difference. It's also, that's the historic trauma element of it, But the other political symbolism of having Turkish troops on the island is this a sovereign state or not? Is Cyprus a sovereign state? There's no reason, is there really a reason in this day and age, 2017, for there to be a foreign army presence in a sovereign state? I'm not advocating the position, but you asked me to explain, this is what I've heard, from the Greek Cypriot side, and I think that those are the main things that have to be taken into account on that item. The other item that I think was troubling was the question of power sharing. And this opens up a topic that we don't have time to get into, but is a very interesting, rich realm of comparison, which is what are the kinds of power sharing arrangements that are made to end conflicts? How separate is separate? How together is together? What's a federation? What's a confederation? What do they mean when they say bizonal, bicommunal federation? Well, in Cyprus, you're supposed to have basically a consociational system on the presidency, right? And there was this idea that there would be a rotating presidency, one Greek Cypriot, one Turkish Cypriot, or the vice presidency, or some sort of consociational approach that ensures equal representation for people who are a minority on the island. And I think that on the Greek Cypriot side, there's always been, a lot of controversy about this. Is this really what they accept and what they want? And Cyprus is one case where I my analysis over the years has led me to say, do both sides truly accept this formulation of bizonal, bicommunal federation that has guided negotiations since 1968? Or are they kind of saying, do we really have to get there? I mean, when there's a problem with a peace process, I tend to think the problem is either with the process or with the peace. And maybe the bizonal, bicommunal federation formula and the way it's been implemented in terms of the agreements, maybe the two sides aren't really so committed to it. And I raise this because we have the same problem on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Is the Israel side really committed to a Palestinian state? Doesn't look like it. Palestinians had to do a lot of changes over the years to get themselves around to the idea of a state in 67 borders. Up until 1988, the general goal was all of historic Palestine. So, you have to really question whether the goal that we're all striving for in any particular process is really, really, truly internalized by the parties. Patron states. I didn't focus specifically on it in the papers, but there is a lot of mention of them. In my PhD thesis, I do focus more on them because you can't have these unrecognized states sustaining themselves all these years without the patron states. And most of these conflicts do have a patron state as well. And they make an appearance in the papers. Again, if you want to look at them, they're there. The ones we're talking about for the purposes of this talk are primarily Turkey, Russia, and the US. And I think that, it goes back to this kind of schizophrenia. On the one hand, the US is, always tries so hard to advance peace in the Middle East, but then has a lot of behavior that contributes to sustaining the conflict. Russia, whatever they say, it's hard to know what they really mean, but the fact that they're at least accused, it's hard to prove this, but accused of selling arms to both sides in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, it's not clear what they want to happen other than sow chaos in the region, which probably is intended to lay the groundwork for them to have more control and more influence, and generate a sphere of influence, certainly in this potentially neo-Cold War space. Turkey, again, I think that of course, is the patron state of Northern Cyprus, and nobody else recognizes Northern Cyprus except for Turkey. And Turkey's interests, again, have changed over the years. So when Turkey wants to nurture an agreement, Turkey was basically supportive or tolerant of the 2004 agreement, and I think would have let it go. And in fact, maybe it was probably emboldening the Turkish Cypriots to support it too, which they did. They passed it in the referendum. Nowadays, excuse me, see what happens when you let me talk too much? I just talk and talk. Nowadays, Turkey doesn't have quite the same incentive. They know they're not going to get into the EU anytime soon. That was the incentive in 2004. Now, Turkey not only doesn't have such incentive to play a really active, helpful role, it has leverage over Europe, the proverbial hand on the tap of the refugees. So, and Erdogan now has all sorts of other considerations at home that he's concerned about. I think that Turkey pretty much goes by Turkey's interest at that time, which evolves. But this changing regional situation, of course, is very relevant for the Middle East, right? There was like a brief glimmer of hope, or at least maybe I wanted to see a glimmer of hope, when President Trump went to Saudi Arabia and made this speech where he said, we want to have a wonderful regional alliance of Sunni states, and there should be Israeli-Palestinian peace, as if he maybe even linked them. Maybe that was just my interpretation. But shifting regional interests are real, proxy politics are real, and I think that the main lesson I would take away when I compare them is if there's a moment where the regional interests line up, grab it because it won't stay.
And on that extremely useful bit of advice, we're going to end this. Thank you so much for attending. We appreciate that. And thank you, Dahlia. Thank you, MEI.